So our next speaker is John Naliboff. And co-authored with Liang too. And they will be talking about feedbacks between coupled surface process models and lithospheric deformation. And so this is a story on like drifting. Please come on up on the podium.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. This is a co-presentation by Zhang and me. So I will cover the background and also the first case study, and Zhang will continue with the second case study and the conclusion. So our title here is the feedbacks between the coupled surface processes and lithospheric deformation during multi-phase continental rifting. So continental rifting here is a place where multiple strong signals of tectonics and climate overlap. And for example, you can find the deepest lakes and also thickest sediments in the continental rift basins and also as summarized by Wu et al. Here in 2022. You can see the rifting itself is characterized by the regional extension and also upwelling of the mantle developmental border fault. And this border fault controls where the sediment flex and the geometry of the rift basin. And in other way around, surface processes can erode the footwall of the border fault and put deposition on the hanging wall. And also you can see on the rift shoulder, there's orographic effects. On the rift basin, thick sediments will cause some thermal blanketing effects. So all those elements come together into continental rifts. That's why we need a coupled model of geodynamics and also landscape evolution. So this effort can go back to 10 years ago, actually 11 years ago, by Yale Law, 2014. You can see this is a coupled model between 3D coupled actually, between Fenton and Cascade. On your left, you can see this is a workflow in one single step of Fenton, and there are multiple steps of the Cascade over here running, and including the get information, mostly velocity, to the triangulated grade, and rate this interpolate this triangulated grade to the finite element grade for the Fenton. And after this study, in more recent years, there's a growing interest in understanding the relationship between climate-driven surface processes and tectonics. For example, on your left is a study by Newhart et al. 2022, showing that how surface processes could impact the strain localization in rift settings. This is a 2.5D studies, and you can see in multiple phases from the top one, initiation of the rift, to necking and continental breaking up. The role of surface processes can vary through all those phases. And on your left is another study by Oliver et al. Their group published work in smaller scale, half a graben scale, looking at how erosional efficiency, is a different parameter to K, can impact the fault throw and also the local relief. And they have validation from the natural examples here. And in 3D view, there are also recent publications on the role of surface processes in rift settings. On your left, Wu et al., another paper in 2022, showing how erosional efficiency can impact rift segmentation, where you can see the two rifts growing and the tips overlap. In the interaction zone, the erosional efficiency, as you can see on the top, can change the segmentation of the rifting. And on your right here is another 3D study showing in the case of the Dead Sea fault, where with some component of strike slip, and the erosional efficiency also can change the topography, uplift field, and also the local relief. Not only on the surface, deeper part, magmatism, there's a large volcanism and magmatism in the rift settings. So you can see the surface mass redistribution, like the rift lakes, can impact the mantle melting, has the potential to impact that, suggested by a study in 2023. And more recently, case study in Yellowstone and also Iceland showing the deglaciation can change more, encourage melting in the mantle and also promote degassing of CO2 on your right. So today, we would like to talk about how the surface processes could impact the evolution of continental rift. We will provide two studies. One is a single phase, another is a multiple phase. The single phase means the extensional direction is constant through our modeling time. And the multi-phase means it changes through time. We'll use the case study in the rifted margin in the southeastern Brazil. So the method we're using is coupled between the Farscape and aspect. So the aspect is geodynamic model. It's short for advanced solver for planetary evolution, convection, and tectonics. It provides solvers for the mass, momentum, and energy equations. And also it can solve the viscoplastic deformation. And for the Farscape, it's a landscape evolution model and also in multiple language. In the community code lab, there's a component called the Farscape eroder over there as well. And this is coupled, as you see in the panel B, by the velocity field. For the first study, as you can see, this is a model setup. We use a box model as a single phase. The extensional direction is from east to west. And as you see from the bottom figure here, and we add the wick zone, you can see it is like 45 degrees to the extensional direction. So we use this wick zone to represent pre-existing thermal or mechanic structures over this region, help to localize the initial strain. So we run the model for 30 million years. That's a little bit long time, and we will look at two end member case, high and low precipitation. That is represented in the K erodibility. So here is the result in topography. So the upper panel here shows the result of the low precipitation, while the lower one shows the high precipitation. So you can see a large difference between the final topography where the low precipitation scenario have a kind of high relief and also a smaller drainage basins, and we can directly see the drainage divide over there. Well, in the high precipitation scenario, we can see a relatively lower local relief, and also we can see the fan system developed in the rift lakes. And also such big difference in surface mass distribution would impact the strain distribution, which is showing in next slides over here. This is a map of strain rate, can be representative of the faulting. And you can see, again, the upper one is a low precipitation scenario, and the lower one shows high precipitation. You can see at the early stage, there will be multiple small faults that is S-shape. We call that echelon structures. And the difference appears during the high precipitation case, all those echelon structure connect rapidly, forming two major faults. That's the border faults of the rift basin. But in the case of the low precipitation, we can see some of the echelon structure remain to the end of the model, and especially they can connect, forming some secondary border fault or inter-rift faults. That is away from initial wick zone. So this difference of the deformation will eventually change the crustal structure. So where you can see this slide is the difference in crustal thickness, where in the upper one, low precipitation case, the rift axis is like about 15 degrees away from the original wick zone, while in the lower case, high precipitation would maintain its geometry along parallel to the wick zone. So if we draw a cross section from east to west, we can see some of the pseudo stratigraphy diagram of the cross-section view. So from here, you can see the difference directly of the rift basin. With more precipitation, we can see a thicker sediments basin, but it's in half graben shape. While in the low precipitation case, it's more like a full graben shape. And also we can see some of the anthetic faults within the basin, and sometimes you can even see the horse structure. So in end member case, where with extremely low precipitation, we can see some of the basin range structures. So all those difference is caused only by the variations in precipitation. To summarize, we can see long-term difference in precipitation and erodibility could impact the rift evolution patterns in both of the stream distribution patterns and also the crustal thinning patterns. For example, high precipitation would promote development of border fault and also forming of the half graben, while low precipitation would promote of those secondary structures that it can be the intra-rift faults or the rift faults on the shoulders. So that's a case study 1, and then I will leave the stage for John for next part.
Thank you, Liang. And so for the next part of the talk, what we're going to go to is thinking about multi-phase rifting at a much larger scale. So what we're going to be focusing on is the Southeast Brazilian margin, which formed during the breakup of Africa and South America during the Gondwana breakup process. And what's interesting in this area, we're going to be focusing on the Santos, Campos, and Pelotas basins to the farther south, is the structure of this basin is tightly tied to the architecture of these belts, which formed during the formation of Gondwana. So basically the architecture of the rifted margin right here is strongly controlled to the shape of the pre-rift structure. The other interesting thing that's happening in this region is you have multiple phases of deformation. What the plot on the right is showing, on the top, it's showing changes in velocity time. So at the beginning of rifting, you have velocities on the order of 5 millimeters per year, which then go all the way up to 50 millimeters per year at the end of rifting. So massive changes in the tectonic forcing. Coupled with that, you also have significant changes in the obliquity. So what we want to look at in this part of the talk is in thinking about how do things like the initial shape of the margin and how does surface processes efficiency affect the long-term evolution of the margin. So going all the way from the initiation of rifting all the way to breakup. So what you're seeing there on the image on the top left is you see these randomized colors. That's an initial zone of randomized weakness in our thermal mechanical simulations that reflect reconstructed coastlines from our colleagues, Douglas Patton and Paul Marwick, who did the plate reconstructions for this project. We're going to apply time-dependent kinematic boundary conditions, which we showed on the previous slide. So you're increasing the rate of extension and the obliquity through time. And just one note, this setup, we're showing you basically the end stages of our product. This was preceded by years of work getting to this point. And a couple notes on the technical complexity of these kind of models. So the models I'm going to show you in the next few slides take about 1 day to run on a little under 1,000 processors. If we slightly increase the complexity, the physical complexity of these simulations, this can result in a 10 to 100 increase in the total runtime. So you can go from running on around 1,000 processors in 1 day to sometimes these may take 1,000 processors on 100 days, which is completely out of hand. So there are some compromises you end up making when you design these simulations. You have to basically tune your physical complexity to within reason so things don't take years on end to run. So what this is looking at is on the left, you're seeing an animation on the top left is showing you the time, and you're looking at the surface strain rate. So this is the rate of active surface deformation at the top of one of these 3D models. And what you're seeing over time is you get to break up around 22 million years. The key is then deformation is initially distributed, but when you look at the images on the right, so this is showing the final crustal thicknesses and also the basin architecture, so the sediment thickness. It's interesting. It actually, even though you're going through multiple phases of deformation, the overall architecture largely matches the shape, it largely matches the orientation of the plate velocity vector. So in this case, it's sort of indicating that even though there's multiple phases of deformation and strong tectonic inheritance, the boundary conditions and tectonic forcing largely rule. So when we initially ran these models, we noticed that there was a discrepancy between the modeled margin rifts, and that basically what we're getting here is significantly narrow margins than what you observe in nature. So then what we did is to sort of try to account for this discrepancy, is we made our models, the initial damage zones, a lot wider, or we made the crust significantly weaker. And so that did help with the margin, sort of the overall fit to the margin architecture. But what you end up seeing is that still the crustal thicknesses and the sedimentary thicknesses at the end of the model, they're not that complicated. They largely reflect the boundary conditions, which is really, really interesting. This is not to say that there's not complicated interactions between the surface processes in this model and the tectonics in the earlier phases of deformation. It's just when you get to the final stages of rifting, you still see this very strong tectonic control in the first order margin architecture. So what we're going to do now is, this is for a KF value of 10 to the minus 7. Now we're going to do something interesting and increase that value by 100 times. So we're going to make the surface processes efficiency significantly. You basically have a lot more erosion and a lot more erodibility in the model. But what you're end up seeing is the results actually don't look that different. There are some variations in the early phases of rifting of what you see, but when you look at the right at the crustal thicknesses and the sedimentary thicknesses, to first order, there are some variations, but to first order, the shape, the architecture of the margin is actually not changing. So what we found in the study is that, from the results that Liang presented, in the early to intermediate stages of rifting, surface processes can have a very strong control. If you go then to tectonic settings, where then you have very fast velocities, so the tectonic forcing is very strong, there's a transition then where surface processes stop having such a large effect, even over orders of magnitude of variability in K, and tectonics takes over. The interesting thing going forward is going to be looking at when this transition happens. And I should note again, these models, there's an enormous amount of complexity in them. There's an enormous amount of physics we don't fully understand yet, especially when you're coupling two systems, which we don't fully understand. So this is literally just scratching the surface on this type of modeling. This is decades of work we're going to be going down the line. So one last thing I wanted to end with, going forward in terms of collaboration between geodynamics and the systems community, is we're actively working on an NSF-funded project to couple land, lab, and aspect. There's an open PhD position I have at New Mexico Tech, which is fully funded for a number of years, if any students here are interested in that. Also, the last thing I'd like to highlight is that the Computational Infrastructure for Geodynamics will be hosting their annual meeting, which may be of interest to some people, in August 4th through 7th in Breckenridge, Colorado, and applications for that are now open. And I'll just leave the acknowledgements up here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for these amazing results. Do we have time? I am trying to decide where we fend between the two speakers and ask maybe one question and then approach them afterwards for more information. Is there a question from the room? Right.
Very cool talk, John. I was curious, I could imagine the climate changing from when you have broad continent to then having a warm sea running through. Have you looked at temporal variations in that erosional efficiency?
No, we haven't yet. But one thing we're thinking about, one of the nice things about working on rifted margins is the density of the seismic data and the controls on the basin architecture, which tells you about climate in the end. So one thing we're thinking about long term is using basically to use the basin information to basically make some inferences about changing climate in time. That's probably, I'd love to say that's a year or two down the line, but we're gonna have to think about that probably over 5 years about how to properly integrate that into simulation. But yes, we are thinking down that lines about how to integrate temporal variability in the climate of these simulations.
Excellent.